Okay, good evening, everyone. The recording is in progress, so that gives me the cue to start officially. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's seminar of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, CSSGJ. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the three co-directors of the center, and I'm going to chair tonight's seminar. It's my pleasure to welcome Angela Wigger from the Netherlands, who will give this evening's seminar presentation. Angela is a specialist within the global political economy, analyzing moments of capitalist crisis from a Marxist perspective. She has published widely in articles on EU industrial policy, shadow banking, EU competition regulation, and there's also a research monograph together with Hubert Buch-Hansen on the politics of European competition regulation. Angela has been for many years on the board of the Critical Political Economy Research Network. I can highly recommend you to join that network if you work in this kind of critical political economy of the European Union. Perhaps, Angela, you want to say a few words also about the network, perhaps during the discussions. But Angela's talk tonight is entitled EU Industrial Policy, Crowding in Investors at the Expense of Democracy. And we are going to proceed in the usual manner. Angela, you will have about 40 minutes for your presentation, and that leaves us then with another 35 to 40 minutes for debate, questions, and answers. Okay? Angela, over to you. Welcome.
I'm gonna share my screen and let me see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the talk you're gonna hear is very much inspired by my coming of age through CPERN, the Critical Political Economy Research Network. I mean, I wouldn't write or think the way I do without the most fantastic critical political economy research that we have, CPERN. But I can say more about CPERN during the discussions. Before outlining the itinerary of my talk, just a few more general thoughts or observations. We can see that industrial policy has been at the forefront of European integration for a while now. And there's like one article after another being published in many journals. And what I do observe is that academics, also politicians, they rather uncritically endorse the new industrial policy, and especially the greening of the industrial policy. They generally interpret it as a move away from the harsh neoliberal state restructuring of the past 4 decades, and a move towards some Keynesian interventionist state policy that does not only tackle the climate emergency, but simultaneously is also providing a solution to the creeping deindustrialization of European economies. And the assumption very often is that industrial policy, and thereby the visible hand of the state, cannot be neoliberal, or that a more neo-mercantilist or protectionist orientation cannot go together with neoliberal capitalism. This does not work. Let me, okay. There's a whole battery of academics, including left-leaning academics like Dani Rodrik and Mariana Mazzucato, who have outed themselves as proponents of an active state as a risk taker and as a market taker. The view is that the state, and this includes the state apparatus of the European Union, should take the lead, invest and stimulate innovation, and only if the state precedes and makes the first move, the private sector will follow, and capitalism will somehow miraculously prosper with the usual assumed trickle-down effects. Note that even though Mariana Mazzucato is very often looked at as a critical scholar, she only wants to change capitalism, not abolish it. It's even in the title. So the idea is that private venture capital will eventually serve on a wave of public investment. And there is, in this literature, but also what you see in the articles, that there's... Oh, okay. There's little discussion about who is accumulating the profits, who controls the innovation process, and for what purpose. So in my talk, I will argue that the current EU industrial policy strategy is deeply problematic because first, it reinforces techno-solutionalism to climate change, which is pushing solutions to mitigate climate change into the future and delaying important political and also painful decisions. And second, that EU industrial policy retains a strong neoliberal core, which is exacerbating regional asymmetries and interclass inequalities. And I will start my journey with historicizing EU industrial policy, and I will provide you with a snapshot overview of the most recent industrial policy initiatives. But I especially want to stop and pause with how EU industrial policy is being financed. And what I mean hereby is the unseen expansion of risk-absorbing financial gimmicks that use public money or that rely on public money or the idea is to use public money to create a leverage effect for private investments. So to use the European Commission's language, these financial instruments seek to crowd in financial investments. And they're not new. They have been around for quite a while. They've been experimented with, especially in the context of private-public partnerships. But also if you look at the work of Daniela Gabor and others, they show how these risk-bearing instruments have been a standard practice within development finance of the European Union. So basically, as a cliffhanger, I will demonstrate that crowding in financial capital, often without any strings attached, is crowding out labor and democratic oversight. And this fosters the continuation of debt-led accumulation regimes, which has major implications for the goal of climate neutrality in the future. And as a last point, I will locate the EU industrial policy against the backdrop of the rentier's capitalism phase that we're currently find ourselves in. But to get started, it was in March this year when European Commission President von der Leyen announced the Green Deal Industrial Plan as a counter-strategy to President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, which consists of a package of $400 billion of conditional subsidies, tax breaks, loan guarantees that are being offered to all sorts of clean tech industries. Think about batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, heat pumps, underground CO2 storage, whatever you have. And when the Inflation Reduction Act was announced, European industries immediately responded with the usual fear-mongering. The act was an existential threat with disastrous consequences for industrial ecosystems, and it would lead to another wave of deindustrialization, job losses, and the overall loss of competitiveness of EU economies. And these voices of doom have worked because Ursula von der Leyen, basically echoing Mario Draghi's iconic speech, she assured the business community that the EU would do everything it can to support European industries in winning the race for leading green technology value chains. We do not hear Ursula von der Leyen saying that the EU would do whatever it takes to decarbonize capitalism and stop climate change. And we have seen various reincarnations of the same story over time. 20 years ago with the Lisbon Agenda, the goal was to make the EU the most competitive and knowledge-based economy and to outcompete the rest of the world. And basically, this very much echoes what we've seen so far. But before moving to the more concrete EU industrial policy initiatives, a bit of context. I mean, indeed, there is we see intensified geopolitical rivalries. There's a pushback in global trades. There's a trade war between the US and China. And we can also see that the pace of offshoring production to emerging markets like China has run out of steam. And many talk about globalization, suggesting that there's a decoupling of global value chains and that sourcing closer to home will becoming more common. And if you look at the European Union, the share of the manufacturing sector of EU GDP formation has been declining for years, and so have public and private investment. We can see on this Bruegel graph that gross fixed capital formation has been on a downward slope for decades. And the European Commission even speaks of extreme underinvestment, especially in Europe's south, where deindustrialization has accelerated, in particular after the 2008 crisis. So basically, austerity has killed the appetite for investments in that area. And at the same time, we can see that the EU trade deficit with China is increasing. Chinese manufacturers have been catching up in the export of some high value added products, with lots of investments in high-tech and strategic industries, including telecommunications, artificial intelligence, robotics, the chip sector, but lots also going into the military industrial complex of China. And Chinese producers also accounting for a third of global patent applications, while the number of applications has been going down in the EU. And on the policy front, we can observe a reassertion of industrial policy basically around the world. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, they have their annual investment reports. And you can read there that it's close to 100 states that have adopted some form of industrial policy over the past few years, together accounting for more than 90% of global GDP. And most of these policies, they take shape as 5-year economic plans or economic development policies or industrial strategies. You can find them in Belize, Cameroon, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and also in China. It was in 2015 when China adopted the Made in China program, which basically seeks to transform the Chinese economy from a low-cost manufacturing hub into a high-tech manufacturing powerhouse. And you can also see the Make in India program, which basically can be read as an invitation: come and produce in India, make India the next manufacturing hub. And we've had Donald Trump's America First, which was much more than just an election slogan. It came with a range of trade and industrial policy components that were targeting domestic manufacturing, privileging domestic companies. And there's not much difference. There's a substantial difference, but not in terms of direction. When you look at the Biden administration, the approach is being dubbed Bidenomics. And it consists of an Infrastructure and Science Act or the earlier Inflation Reduction Act. And there's also a CHIPS Act and more to come. And around the same time, the European Commission announced its own industrial policy strategy, which was titled For a European Industrial Renaissance. But before sort of working out what the European Industrial Renaissance is all about, more generally, what is industrial policy? And I don't want to spend too much time with conceptualizations, but rather emphasize that industrial policy usually consists of a whole array of state policies that seek to orientate industry towards specific development paths. And they often come in packages of measures, which basically can cater to different class fractions simultaneously. So industrial policy can seek to intervene in the geographical composition of production. It can bolster ascending or descending industrial sectors or technologies, so-called sunshine or sunset industries. And it can include macroeconomic policies such as fiscal, monetary, environmental, trade, innovation, education, labor policies, you name it. And basically these macroeconomic policies, they are referred to as horizontal because they treat all firms and sectors equally, whereas vertical industrial policies are more selective, state interventionist policies, picking winner type of strategies, nurturing champions. And but the industrial policy is not set in stone, it's historically contingent. And something to remember is it can also temper class rivalries. It can theoretically give labor and other organized interests a say in the strategic orientation and control of investment and innovation. Unfortunately, this is not the case under the EU industrial policy as we see it now. But when historicizing, and I put my book together with Hubert Buch-Hansen into this, because it was not only about competition regulation, it was about industrial policy. And it is not new industrial policy. Industrial policy has been a key feature of European integration at the outset. If you think about the European coal and steel community, which was one big giant industrial policy, and similar, the common agriculture policy is also industrial policy at the end of the day. And if you look at it more broadly, the European integration consisting of the gradual reconfiguration of several economies into one single market can be seen as a sort of meta-industrial policy. But what is interesting is that the Treaty of Rome did not mention industrial policy with a word. So industrial policy at the time was not considered a designated community competence, but more sort of the prerogative of the member states. At the same time, the preambles of the Treaty of Rome declared a high degree of competitiveness and overarching community goal. And this indirectly laid the groundwork for a supranational industrial policy. But what we saw is that at supranational community level, it was competition policy that operated as a functional equivalent of a supranational industrial policy, both in terms of horizontal policy and vertical policy. And just a quick overview, if you go back in time, the post-war decades of European integration, you could see that the DG competition, the supranational competition of authority in charge, has very generously allowed for state aid at member state level. So member states always needed to notify and get permission from the supranational competition authority, the DG competition, when they wanted to give state aid. Think about subsidized loans, tax concessions, guaranteed procurement contracts. There's different forms of state aid. And the European Commission also was very permissive on all sorts of cross-border intercompany agreements like joint ventures, or allowing for economic concentration through mergers and acquisitions. And it also left preferential treatments of state-owned enterprises basically untouched, even though it could have commanded the privatization of public monopolies. So there was a very permissive stance, and you can interpret sort of the post-war enforcement of competition regulation as industrial policy. And the way the competition rules were enforced played a key role in establishing the prerequisites for the creation of national and increasingly European champions that sustained Fordist accumulation regimes. But fast forward to the rise of neoliberal ideas in the mid-1980s, industrial policy withered away in name. It came to be denounced as old-fashioned and inefficient, and it was criticized for rescuing industries that had lived past their glory times. And at DG competition level, the DG industry was abolished at some point. There was always a DG industry, an internal market, but the industry disappeared. And state aid and national industrial policies, picking winners, were considered anti-competitive. And I once conducted an interview with the DG competition official, and he compared it to woodworms eating away the carcass of integration. So this was pretty much the time of when European integration was declared, suffering from euroclerosis, where industrial policy was functioning under the radar. It never fully disappeared. And then when we had the economic and monetary union in the 1990s, this basically made government spending very, very difficult. So there was less of industrial policy at some point. I think we can all admit to that. And the Maastricht Treaty is actually quite interesting. In 1993, it included an article that basically prohibited interventionist, selective vertical industrial policy strategies at member state level. So we had industrial policy being mentioned in the treaties for the first time, but then in a way that it prohibited the vertical interventions. But instead, horizontal industrial policy measures such as research and development and innovation policies, as well as policies on education and training to raise the skill of labor force, that was all allowed. And what we also could see was that industrial policy re-emerged under the guise of private-public partnerships. The central idea, I'm moving too fast. The central idea back then was that a stringent application of competition laws and fierce capitalist competition in a context of an open global market would automatically enhance the global competitiveness of European industries. And that through neoliberal regulations, the competitiveness of entire EU economies would be elevated. So also the neoliberal phase was very much entrenched by industrial policy. But what we see over the past 10 years, that a whole array of industrial policy programs and funds have been adopted at European Union level. And the industrial policy offensive started in around 2000. If you look at the annual European Commission communications, there was always somewhere the need for an overarching industrial policy mentioned in one of these communications. And in 2004, the communication was quite outspoken for a European industrial renaissance. And what always struck me was the fact that, I mean, the European Commission didn't even bother to change the title. The whole communication was inspired by a position paper by the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which was titled EU Industrial Renaissance Agenda for Action 2014 to 2019. And then we had the 2014 Industrial Renaissance document was not really saying that much, just a couple of pages. So in 2017, there was the renewed EU Industrial Policy Strategy, and in March this year, we had the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And there's many more smaller communications in between. But what does the new EU industrial policy seek to achieve? It's basically similar to America First. It comes with the undertone of an EU First or Make Europe Great Again strategy. And it is first and foremost about boosting industrial competitiveness. I mean, it's ingrained in the treaties. So if we hear Ursula von der Leyen giving priority to industrial competitiveness, she's really following the treaties. And the hierarchy is very clear also if you go through the various commission documents. It's about restoring an attractive investment climate, induce export-led growth, and then we have this buzzword of an open strategic autonomy, and we have to establish technological sovereignty, and we're talking about the strategic autonomy of industries and not societies in the first place. And it very much has also the language of that it aims at backshoring manufacturing capacity in key industries away from emerging markets and reduce geopolitical dependencies on global supply chains and also raw materials. We have the Raw Material Act that has that is now being cooked up. And it is very much all about strengthening intra-EU value chains so that manufacturing exports can be branded as made in Europe. That's another policy document, made in Europe. So industrial policy seeks to induce a European value chain industrialization. And yes, somewhere down the line, it also seeks to enact the twin transition to a digital and green economy. And the order of the words is very important. It's always digital first and then green economy. Why does a green transition have to be digital first? And why are digital and green treated as having the same urgency? So the assumption very much is also that there are technical solutions to the climate emergency, and we have to tackle the digital transition first in order to enable a green economy. And basically, we do not need political solutions at the end of the day. So how does the new EU industrial policy look like, the concrete policy initiatives? And I have to admit that the entire list that I'm portraying here is not complete, because industrial policy initiatives are difficult to trace as they are cross-cutting various directorate generals. So industrial policy is basically being mainstreamed in all sorts of policy domains and blended into existing and new funding streams, such as, for example, the EU cohesion policy. It's all, you could say it has always been industrial policy, but now we see concrete industrial policy programs within EU cohesion policy. So like smart specialization, for example, I've written about this for those who would like to know more. But just to mention a couple of examples. So we see a lot of Industry 4.0 initiatives that seek to facilitate so-called disruptive technologies in the field of robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, 3D printing, Internet of Things, you name it. There's also the Digital Single Market Act. There's a Steel Action Plan. And basically, the European Commission has announced that it will have a sort of action plan for every imaginable industry. We haven't seen that becoming manifest yet, but it's a plan. And you can see from the list that it's not only sort of green technologies. I mean, the European Defense Action Plan is part of industrial policy. It seeks to foster a competitive and innovative military-industrial complex. And more recently, we've had the CHIPS Act, the Repower EU Act, which seeks to reduce energy imports. And the EU Net Zero Industry Act has just been adopted by the European Parliament 7 days ago, I believe, which aims at having 40% of the new green technologies homegrown by 2030. And there's a lot of flanking policies that come with it. But how is this all being financed? I mean, the EU budget is extremely small. It's comparable to that of Denmark. And the EU budget always needs to be in balance. I mean, the EU is officially not allowed to run a deficit. The EU cannot take on debt. And member governments do not have much fiscal leeway either in the context of EU public deficit and debt rules. So what we see is, getting a message here. Okay, that on the one hand, we see that the EU state aid rule enforcement is temporarily being relaxed, and that's beyond the important projects of common European interest, which is one industrial policy strategy and the Green Industrial Plan. So basically, whenever there is a financing concerns an EU industrial policy project, member states no longer have to notify their state aid to the European Commission. So these type of waivers are making their inroads. And what we also see is a redirection of some of the long-standing structural funds for more concrete industrial policy purposes. But what is the larger chunk or like what is growing is that the new EU industrial policy is geared towards seducing private financial capital investors to invest. And the seduction takes various forms. It is by first creating an investment-friendly business climate. That also comes with the sort of internal devaluation strategies and reducing labor in order to make Europe attractive for investments. But there's many more aspects to that. So there's more sort of a general element. And second, the idea is to use public money, EU, national or regional public, non-reimbursable co-financing as a precursor for attracting private sector credit enhancements or equity investments. And third, the strategy is to create a safe harbor for finance capital through guarantees and counter guarantees on the basis of the EU budget or the liquidity reserves of the European Investment Bank, or there are several funds that have been established, such as the Common Provisioning Fund, for example. And the logic is to channel investments away from the speculative activities in the bloated financial sphere to the real production sphere, and using public money and thereby create a multiplier effect and leverage ever more private investments into manufacturing. And sometimes you can see expected leverage ratios of 1 to 30, meaning basically that every public euro that is being spent or guaranteed is expected to lead to 30 euros in private investment. And with the recently with this Invest EU, which is not a fund, it's just a risk-bearing facility, the leverage ratio is 1 to 13.7. And it's just fantasy figures that the European Commission is using. And what is very important is it says Invest EU. So it does not say EU Invest, because the EU does not invest. It is just a guarantee, a leverage mechanism for private investors. And I was checking for other places in the world, but Invest India works in a similar fashion. So it's the EU is not even unique in that, and so the same is true for the US. There's also the public guarantee to unlock private investment strategy. And the European Union currently uses 36 different risk-absorbing financial instruments, and 23 employed for within the EU and 13 for beneficiaries outside of the EU. And these instruments, there must be more in number by now, so I'm not sure how accurate my counting is. But they're partially governed by the financial regulation, which governs the EU budget. And what we can see is that since 2014, the financial regulation has been loosened considerably. It allows to use the EU budget as a guarantee or counter guarantee to cover the investor losses, not only for EU or national development banks, but all sorts of financial capital. So ranging from commercial banks, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, private equity, angel investors, venture funds, you name it, everything that looks and smells like money can account for the sort of the risk absorption through the EU budget. And these instruments, they absorb or share a part of the risks of either equity or quasi-equity investments. And I find the notion of quasi-equity fascinating, because it means you invest, you're being equity for a particular number of years, and after this has reached maturity, you're being the equity is being transformed into a loan, so debt. But these instruments, they also cover the risk of loans that are granted to corporate beneficiaries. And there's also an open door category referred to as other risk-sharing instruments. So basically, the European Commission can invent risk-sharing instruments as it goes. And these instruments, they can be combined or blended with other forms of financial support, such as grants from one of the EU's 43 funds, member states, and they can also go together with bank-sponsored securitization of debt portfolios. I think So to use the European Commission's own language, the idea is to use the firepower of financial instruments and thereby minimize the budgetary outlays for the public sector. So basically, providing corporate beneficiaries with non-repayable grants, you can spend €1 only once. But if you use the budget or the funds of the European Investment Bank Group or the existing structural funds as a revolving guarantee fund, you can use that source multiple times over for future private investors and thereby unlock ever more private sector funding. So what we're seeing here is that the EU is about to transform into Lehman Brothers. And who has been driving these financial gimmicks? What type of fractions do we see? And I'm still sort of disentangling like who has been intervening when. But we see that I'm not moving. For example, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager and the biggest or second biggest shareholder of 12 of the largest 15 European banks, and also a huge investor in fossil fuels, has advised the European Commission on the introduction of a whole array of financial products. Products that would allow, and I'm using the words of BlackRock, investors to secure cash flows and acceptable levels of risks in order to make funding instruments for or investments into the European economies. And it's especially Corporate Europe Observatory. It has a couple of really good reports on where they show how the Commission is basically handing over the steering wheel to big finance. And this is just a couple of quotes here by an email of a BlackRock employee to the European Commission about the EU's Net Zero Industry Act, which was considered like, yeah, we can't be too happy about it. We're very much underwhelmed because there is a lack of committed funding. So whereas the Inflation Reduction Act has like no ceiling for the funding that can be given to clean tech industries and also the risk absorption mechanisms, the European Union is much more hesitant, and this has been a complaint by BlackRock. But why is this all problematic? Oh, I'm moving too fast. Okay, yeah, I'm leaving it with this for the time being. I mean, why do we have to challenge EU industrial policy? It was actually in 2017, so 5 years ago, that the European Parliament, as the democratic control institution for the EU budget, has been complaining about, and I'm quoting, the highly complex and opaque galaxy of funds and instruments around the EU budget. So we're talking about a labyrinth of hybrid financing channels for EU industrial policy programs. And there is anecdotal evidence that even the European Commission itself has lost the oversight. So it had to hire experts on temporary contracts to manage the EU debt operations. And in order to get back in control, it has established a new post called Chief Risk Officer, who is responsible for all the risk-absorbing instruments in the future. So, but what is more, these financial instruments, they are increasingly deployed off balance sheet. This means the European Commission, together with the Council, can bypass the democratic oversight of the European Parliament, whose budgetary powers are limited to the EU budget only. So what you see is that the EU is, in the name of the AAA rating of the EU 27, is obtaining money from capital markets, and this is off balance sheet, using a fund to guarantee the risks in case there are liabilities. So what we see here is that EU industrial policy is crowding out democracy. And what is also very important, within set parameters, it is financial capital that decides who cannot or can receive a loan on the basis of these EU guarantees. And it is financial capital that ultimately decides about the speed of decarbonizing capitalism and the much needed energy transition and whether or not we stop climate change. I mean, these EU industrial policy programs, they are voluntary and they very often come with no strings attached. So this has severe redistributional costs for labor and society at large, because the risks of the private investors are socialized through the artillery of public money, while the rewards and profits remain privatized. And labor is totally eclipsed from the analysis and discussions and the potential profits that are being generated. So EU industrial policy is crowding out labor and society at large. And EU industrial policy is fostering rentier's capitalism. It's based, in addition to the equity investments that have the risks covered, or part of the risks, most of it is debt, private debt. So EU industrial policy is based on debt-led accumulation patterns. The economy is being subsidized by debt to pump up the economy. And debt comes with a giant ecological footprint. I mean, to disentangle this, the issuance of debt and the trading of debt instruments is one instance of rentier's capitalism. If we understand rentier's capitalism, I'm using Brett Christopher's and others' definition as a parasitic type of capital accumulation through extracting rent from the ownership and control of scarce assets rather than actual production. Basically, what Marx in Grundrisse, the quote I put here, is covering as well. So, but in addition to debt and trading of debt instruments, we also see that corporations are investing in non-productive activities. In many sectors, corporations are using their liquidity or even debt to finance, back in when debt was came with very low interest rate, to finance share buybacks or to make dividend payments. In the Netherlands alone, shareholder remunerations have increased by 500% over the past 20 years, while debt levels have increased significantly. But you can also see rentier's capitalism if you look at investments in mergers and acquisitions. Corporations are taking over other companies with the purpose to absorb monopoly rents, to get access to intangibles such as rent-generating patents and other forms of intellectual property or goodwill. And such non-productive investments can exceed investments in research and development and fixed direct production-related assets. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we're currently using public money, state aid, and also the financial instruments. The risk absorption is state aid at EU level, for financing or seducing financial sector players to invest into industries which themselves are not investing. And the question is, like, how much more debt can societies absorb? How much more debt can we afford within our planetary boundaries? I mean, indebtedness is not only leading to financial instability at the end of the day, but it also comes with this giant ecological footprint. To service that, we need economic growth. Growth based on even technological breakthroughs is not automatically free from greenhouse gas emissions, resource extraction, or energy consumption. And at some point, debtors will prioritize short-term economic growth over long-term ecological and social sustainability. So the debt-financed technological fixes as a solution to climate change is on multiple fronts an act of procrastination. So we're discounting on the future. And we have to take difficult political decisions now. Of course, clean tech solutions can mitigate climate change. I'm not going to deny that. But we have to rearrange our priorities and putting systemic change up front. I think that was my talk. I'll stop sharing, and I'm curious, like, how many people have made it through my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Angela. We are still all here. Fascinating presentation. Worrying, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's basically next Ponzi scheme kind of investment scheme, yeah, and all dressed up as responding to climate change, yeah.